On behalf of the City of Delaware, and especially the Parks and Recreation Department who manages Oak Grove, I would like to welcome you to Oak Grove Cemetery. My name is Amy Wright, and since last summer I have been the cemetery administrator for the grounds here. I would just like to give you a little brief overview of the cemetery and talk to you about some of what we have going on and what the future looks like for the cemetery. Just to welcome you to this tour, thanks for coming out. We appreciate your time and your energy. We really hope you enjoy these grounds. This is one of my favorite places in the entire city of Delaware. I was born and raised here, and since starting to work for the city 4 years ago and then coming on board with the cemetery, I've really learned so much, and I'm just so excited that we get to share our special place with you today. These grounds were purchased in 1850, about 50 acres, $1,500 for 50 acres. The original cemetery was located down by the river where Ohio Wesleyan's Selby Stadium is currently located. It had fallen into disrepair, and they were aware that they needed more space, so they purchased this property from the Kilbourne family and began, moving family grave sites and whatnot. The first burial took place here in July of 1851. Her name was Elizabeth McCracken. We have since worked really hard to take care of these grounds. The city took over in 2012, and we've taken over maintenance of the grounds and whatnot. We commissioned a master plan in 2018 for the further development of the property. There's about an additional 20 acres that was purchased at some point on the western side of the grounds, and partially that remains undeveloped. So what we're looking to is to develop for the future. We're looking to offer more options. There are still spaces for full burial available in the cemetery. We just installed our first columbarium unit, which is niches for cremation urns. So we're working on the development of a scattering garden for those who like to scatter cremation ashes. The benefit to doing that in a cemetery is that there will be records kept, and probably some kind of a memorial for names and dates to be listed, so that your relatives can come and visit perpetually. We're really looking to kind of rebuild this property into the park-like setting that it was originally developed as. In the late 19th century, there was a movement towards what were known as garden cemeteries. So your parks designers like Frederick Law Olmsted and all of his contemporaries, this layout, the original layout of the cemetery was patterned after the types of things that were happening during that time. The Victorians took death very seriously, but they also wanted it to be a beautiful thing. So the idea was develop a park-like setting where people could come and recreate and enjoy the peace, picnic, what have you. And so we would really kind of like to restore the cemetery to that type of a setting where people want to come, they want to visit, they want to reflect, maybe go for a nice walk. So in the future, watch for us to be adding some programming, historical programming, nature programming, physical fitness possibly. The possibilities are endless, but we're really excited for what the future holds for Oak Grove. If you are interested in talking to me further, I can be reached. You can find me through the city website. Again, my name is Amy Wright. Reach out. I'd love to talk to you about options in the cemetery. I really hope you enjoy your time with us at Oak Grove. Thank you.
Oh, good to see you all come up. Good to see you all. I don't think, in looking around, that I recognize anybody here. Anyway, I'm Fred Marice, and I got distracted here. Somebody brought this thing over here to me and asked me if I knew what it was. I said, I have no idea. I mean, it has all those numbers on it, and I think I've figured it out a little bit. I think it's for surveying ground. I think if, like that hill right over there, I think if you match up the numbers, it tells you how high the hill is and how wide the hill is over there. I'm not sure, but I'm going to take it to the surveying office after I'm done here today, and maybe they can figure out what this thing's for. Anyway, welcome here. As I say, I don't think I recognize any of you, but I'm Fred Bar-Ice, and I have the shoe store downtown. In fact, when you're all done here today, why don't you take those feet and you just follow them right on down Sandusky Street and through the store, and I can fit you all a new pair of shoes. I've been there for around 50 years that I've been a-working there. And I'll tell you what, my father was there first, so that store, that is one of the oldest businesses in this town. And I just can't believe that I've been here all this time. And you know, when I started, by the way, a little bit about me. I was born on Eaton Street, 16 Eaton Street. Not too far from here, of course. And then I went to South School. Then I went to the Central School. And then after that, I didn't ever get to quite go to that Delaware High School. That new one they built down there. It was just a few years after I got out of school. And oh, and say about that. Then, if any of you are from around here now, that school would remember when it burnt down. I mean, we could see the darn thing from our house. We could see those flames just shooting up, and we headed down there in that tower from the school, came crashing down there on Winter Street. All that was left when it was over was just the shell of the building. I mean, just the walls is all that was left standing on that building. And my gosh, it turned into the biggest school fight you'd ever seen. I mean, all those students, they were so mad when they found out they're going to take those walls and rebuild the inside. And they kept saying, you're going to cause that building to fall down right on us and kill us all. Well, that's been about 1925. Yeah, it's been about 15 years ago now, and they're still using the darn thing anyway. You know, going back to the fact, I didn't really recognize anybody here, and it reminds me though of this. Lillian, my wife, and I were sitting downtown on the bench, or we're sitting downtown there, and we happened to see just a little ways away this couple walk by. And I said to Lillian, Lillian, I remember that man. He's a customer of ours, but I can't remember his name. She couldn't remember the name either, and I said, I can't remember the name, but I sure remember that his wife, she has wide feet. And he's got a bunion on the side of his foot that sticks out. Then I have to take that instrument and soften out the shoe so he can fit it on there just right. You know, you deal with your customers, but oftentimes I can't remember their names, but I know what shoe size they wear. Anyway, I've been there, as I say, for a long time. You know, I didn't get married till I was 41 years old to Lillian. And we moved over there onto Oak Hill, and I got active in the community. In fact, I became one of the founders of the Chamber of Commerce of this town and became their president. And also was one of the founders of the Kiwanis Club in this town. But, you know, about this town, and things that I remember about here, going back away, probably a lot of you might remember it if you've been around here at all. Remember back when that big flood hit? Oh my word, when the 1913 flood hit, came right into our store. Now we weren't hit as bad as a lot of the others because it only came up a little ways. We had little damage, but not like the rest. You know, and I remember that day when we went down there, we found out that the ice wagon horse had survived the flood. One of the three did, and it crawled up into the hay mow way up above. And it was sitting there just as happy eating all that hay. And it seemed like the whole town, when they heard it had survived, they came down to see the horse, and Lillian and I did that also. We came down to take a look at that. Oh, and all the things that go on downtown. Oh, my word. When the fair was over on the east side, and then they moved it way on down here to Powell. I mean, way to Powell. Well, think about all those people up at Radnor, and how the heck are they going to get all the way down there to Powell? I wish they'd bring that Delaware County Fair back into this town sometime, here in the center of the county where everybody could see it. But anyway, they did bring in, though, a pumpkin show. right there on that main street, you know. My favorite thing about the pumpkin show, you'd go down there to the main corner, and that's where that huge Ferris wheel was located. And then there was a tight wire that went from the top of the one building on the north side of the street all the way up there onto the city hall. And a guy some crazy guy walks across that wire. And if you're the really fortunate ones, you're on the Ferris wheel when he's doing it. And my word, if you're the top person when that Ferris wheel stops and looks out on that man walking right there by you, right out there in front of you. Oh, that was a great time. Oh, and the parades. Oh my. When I came out of the store and all those crowds, I saw it twice. Saw this happen twice. The Wild West Show of Buffalo Bill. As they came down William Street, and then they turned onto Sandusky right there, right past my store, and he and Annie Oakley were in that carriage just waving to us and all. My, what a time. We got to go and see their show, too. Speaking of shows, they're at that city hall. Now, they used to have a lot of shows in there. Well, they still do have them in there. Yeah, I advise you to go down there and see them. I remember the favorite one that I remember was John Philip Sousa and the band. And they came in there, and the loudness of that. And when they played that song, dun 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 dun, bum 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 bum. Oh my word, did that crowd ever go wild over that? Oh yeah, all kind of nice things in this town. Of course, then came the big war. And my word, so many people that died in that. Now, you know, our family came from Germany, from Nuremberg. Came over here, started that store, and then those Germans, our ancestors, start up that war that causes havoc in the entire world. It was a terrible thing, all those tens of thousands of people dying. And I tell you, those Germans were nasty people. We may have been Germans, but they were nasty people, and in fact, down here, you know, in the county, Berlin Township. That's what they call it now. Of course it wasn't then. Back then, before the war, Berlin Township and Berlin Station. Now, no. We won't have anything to do with Germany. It's Berlin and Berlin Station. Oh, yes, I remember that, and we just hope, and I think maybe it's true, that it was the war to end all wars. Nothing like that would ever happen again. Oh, I've wandered on, and I think I've pretty well said as much as I want. You're getting ready to move on, I'm sure, too. And hopefully those feet of yours are just going to wander you up that Sandusky Street and buy a pair of my shoes. It's good to be with you all today.
Hello. I appreciate you stopping by today. I'm Ezra Griswold. It's nice to get out and have a chance to stretch some. As you can see, I'm not originally from this area. I started my life, up in the reserve in Connecticut, and moved here early on with the family. Dad was a printer, decided to come this way when I was just a lad. I was about 11 when we left Connecticut. All the others coming this way, well, they came in wagons, drawn by horses, but Dad had all the printing equipment. So we came a slightly different way. We came by ox cart. Now I know you're thinking Griswold. If you're from this area, you might be thinking Griswold Street, and yes, that's the same Griswold. But if you're not from this area and you're thinking about a long trip, you might be thinking about a different Griswold. No, this was no vacation, and that ox cart was no family truckster, I can tell you that. But the thing about traveling by ox cart is that it's faster. It's faster than coming by horse and wagon because you don't get stuck so much. So we actually arrived here several weeks before the rest of the group from Connecticut. landed first, just south of here, not in Delaware, but down in Worthington. And that's where the family settled, and Dad opened the first paper. That ran for several years, and ultimately we opened a tavern there in Worthington. It was there until, 5 or 6 decades ago when you all finally tore it down. There's a story about that tavern that, various famous people stayed there. My favorite one is that Charles Dickens was a guest at one point during his 2 travels to the U.S. To that I say, bah humbug. Dickens did travel through Columbus, but he didn't stay in this area, and even if he did, well, what he wrote about Ohio afterwards, we wouldn't want to claim him anyway. Ultimately, in my early 20s, decided to take the trek, up into the northern hinterlands, and that was Delaware. And that brought us up here, about 1818. Delaware did have a paper. Well, most cities had 2 or 3 or 4 papers at the time, but I started another one anyway. In fact, 2 other papers. And after a few years of those 2 papers, well, another paper came up for sale here in Delaware, and I decided to buy it. Came to be a little too much to have that many newspaper interests running at one time, so I decided to merge them together into the Ohio Reporter. And that paper ultimately later on became what you now, even today, know as the Delaware Gazette. It was interesting. In those days, it wasn't like now. You all have television now. And now you think of newspapers, I think of being sort of cold and dispassionate, just giving you the news and not taking a position on things, not like your television talking heads with your sides that they take. But newspapers did that back then. Every city back then had a Democratic newspaper and, well, in that era, a Whig newspaper. And the Gazette, the Gazette was Delaware's Whig newspaper, pushing the Whig issues of the day, the Whig candidates of the day. Until, of course, 1854, when the Whig Party became the Republican Party. And at that point, the Gazette became the Republican paper in Delaware. Of course, I'd long sold it by then. I sold it in the 1830s. Had enough of the newspaper business by then and decided to move on. If you come here to the cemetery and you look around, you'll see here not only the grave, but also several more smaller ones just here behind me to my left. My wife and I had 8 children. Not uncommon for the era. I know you're thinking in this day and age that 8 children is a lot, but back then it wasn't. In part, of course, because of the child mortality of the day. In fact, you'll see 4 of the children's graves here who didn't live past either infancy or, in one case, early childhood. 4 of the kids, though, did live much longer. 3 of the sons lived into their 80s, 1 into his 90s, into the World War I era. And they were all successful businessmen as well, not in the newspaper industry. They saw Dad get out of that much earlier on. The grave might be a giveaway here as well, that I was also active with the Masons. In fact, there was quite a funeral procession here. Not the normal somber funeral procession of the day, but a parade, if you will, from the church in town down here to Oak Grove Cemetery, where the Masons put on quite a celebration here in 1863. I'm glad you all came out today. I hope you enjoy the rest of what you have here, and I hope you still subscribe to that good old Delaware Gazette here, some 150, 160 years on later, still in business, still working, still printing, and still bringing you the news.
Bonjour classe, je m'appelle Mademoiselle Charlotte Dennison, and I teach English, French, and history at Willis High School, where later I became the assistant principal. We are surrounded by my family here, who helped to build Delaware, literally, with fireproof clay tiles. Now, my parents were Charles and Edna Dennison, buried over here. But my mother passed away, unfortunately, when I was 10 years old, so my father remarried when Mariette Dennison. She was quite young. And I had one sister, her name was Adele Hortense. She married Homer, and they are buried right next to me over here. Now, when I was growing up, we lived at 52 West Winter Street in a beautiful house right across from what's now the Andrews House. And my grandparents lived right next door in 56 West Winter Street
In my house, we had a pipe organ that my father used to play for visitors. It was a wonderful time. Now, I did have a little brother named Charles who passed away at age 5, and he's buried right over here next to my parents. Now, my father and grandfather were very enterprising men. They owned a large farm, tracts of land down by Beanaller Road off 315. We used to spend a lot of time down there. And when I was growing up in the 20s, I didn't just stay in Delaware. I traveled with my grandparents. I went to camps in Kentucky and Cincinnati. I took a driving trip with my father in 1923, 15 days, and we went across the eastern United States. Now, when I was ready to go to college, I attended Ohio Wesleyan right here in Delaware, and I majored in French. I graduated in 1931. My picture is in the yearbook. So after college, I got a job at Willis High School, and in 1946, I became the assistant principal, and I kept all of you in line. In 1951, when the Delaware Writing Club put on a horse show at the fairgrounds, I was the show secretary. Now, I was also a secretary for my family's business. My uncle and father ran the Delaware Clay Company. Here is my brother-in-law, Homer, and there is myself when we sold the clay company to a company in Arkansas. Thank you. Now, when we sold that business in 1967, it was the oldest industrial concern in Delaware County. So my great-grandfather, Wesley Dennison, buried right here, and my grandfather and my father, Leonard, buried right here. They started the business, Delaware Clay, in 1877. At first, they were at a site south of Pennsylvania Avenue, just along the west side of the railroad tracks near Hayes High School. And in the 1890s, they moved to a new site on West William Street, and it was just east of the Big 4 railroad overpass. Now, there, at that site, they got into fireproof building material, fireproof clay tiles, ceiling tiles, roof tiles. But then they sold the business, and they enlarged again, and then they moved to the final site on Cheshire Road. It was a very large enterprise, quite an industrial site, but in the 70s, we were unable to keep up with, we didn't have enough natural gas to sustain the works, we weren't able to expand, and so we had to sell the business, unfortunately. So that was in 1972 that my family had to sell the clay works. So my great-grandfather, Wesley Dennison, was very influential in building Delaware. He had 4 sons. My father, Leonard, Louis, John, and William, all buried right around here. They were all successful. I have a picture of them right here. Here is Louis, my father, Leonard, John, and William, businessmen all. So Louis was a civil engineer. He started the Delaware Bridge and Iron Company. Wesley and Leonard started Delaware Clay, the company that we later had to sell, and then he later joined with the Cook brothers to found Cook Motors, which then became Dennison Engineering. Now, Leonard, my father, and William purchased land on the east side of Henry Street, where they wanted to start a sanitarium and a bottling plant. But they weren't able to make that go, so they sold the land to Ohio Wesleyan University, and it's now Selby Stadium. So all 4 of the brothers and their children, including my father, were involved in businesses. Many were awarded patents for their inventions, but I can't tell all those stories now. Here I am when I was assistant principal of Willis High School. I lived to be 96 years old, and I passed away in 1995, and I'm buried right here in Oak Grove Cemetery. Thank you.
Hello, my name is James Eaton. I was an early Delaware County land surveyor. I served as Delaware County surveyor from 1822 to 1842. And land surveying was really important in the formation of our country, because there were 3 major land ordinances which helped kind of foster the beginning of land development in the United States. There was the ordinance of 1784, which was passed by Congress on April 23rd, 1784, called for the land in the recently created United States located west of Appalachian Mountains, north of the Ohio River, and east of the Mississippi to divide it into separate states. And then the ordinance of 1785 provided for the scientific survey, where you had land surveyors come out to create, to actually do the surveying of the land. And it created a systematic subdivision of those lands. The land was to be subdivided according to a rectangular grid system. The basic unit of land grant was the township, which was a square area measuring 6 miles on each side. And then the third ordinance was the 1787 ordinance, known as the Northwest Ordinance. It was eventually passed by Congress on July 13, 1787. This ordinance created the Northwest Territory and established a territory government with General Arthur St. Clair as the first governor. The ordinance was also proposed that the Northwest Territory should be divided into more than 3 states, but not less than 5. It also decreed that when the adult male population of the area would reach 5,000, the inhabitants could elect their own legislature. And when the population would increase to 60,000 inhabitants, then the area would be admitted to the Union on an equal basis with the original U.S. states. So on March 1st, 1803, the state of Ohio became the first state to be created from this vast area of the Northwest Territory. It was followed by the creation of the U.S. states of Indiana in 1816, Illinois in 1818, Michigan in 1837, Wisconsin in 1848, and Minnesota in 1858. As my own story, I was born just 2 days shy of our nation's 21st birthday on July 2nd, 1797, to Joseph and Bathsheba Eaton, descendants of Welsh immigrants who fled persecution in Wales, coming to the United States. In 1805, my parents moved to Ohio, settling in Berkshire and then ultimately Berlin Township, which was carved off of Berlin, near a tributary of Olive Creek or Big Run. And I took up my father's profession of land surveying, as that was an important profession during the growth of our nation. Some of the basic tools that the surveyors used in the day was, one was known as a Gunter's chain. It's a 66-foot chain divided into 100 links, usually marked off into groups of 10 by brass rings or a tag. Some of the ones might look like a hand, but they'll have the numbers of the each foot going up to the 10-foot links. And each link is 7.92 inches long, and the Gunter's chain was a mathematical tool and measurement invented in 1620 by Edward Gunter. And this is a way to divide the land simply, and you multiply the chain to calculate the most pre-existing units of land. For instance, 10 square Gunter's chains would be equal to an acre of land. And that was incredibly important because it was one of the major tools to use to measure land. Another tool was the compass. And there were 3 types that they had here. One was a plain compass, which just had its needle, and they could point to the magnetic North Pole. By turning the compass in the direction of the line being surveyed, the direction of that line can be observed. And the next one was a vernier compass, and the vernier compass had an adjustable scale that allows for the setting off of the magnetic declination of the compass and can directly read true north. And the third was a solar compass. This was important because it had a significant impact on surveying public lands with rich mineral resources. It was invented by United States Deputy Surveyor William Austin Burt in 1836. It was designed to overcome the difficulty experienced with magnetic declination in areas where iron deposits were prevalent. And the solar compass had a solar apparatus which enabled the surveyor to determine the meridian from the declination of the sun instead of by means of a magnetic needle. And Burt's invention received a medal at the Hyde Park, London, England Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851. He was also responsible for locating the Calumet and Hecla mine in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which became one of the largest copper-producing mines of his time. These instruments and their dedicated surveyors played an invaluable role in development of today's boundaries and establishment of land ownership in the United States. Without them, the country's infrastructure, resource management, and future western settlements would not be possible. Another tool was a theodolite, and it could be mounted on a tripod and would used by the survey to measure both the horizontal and vertical angles. A level. The surveyor used a level to determine elevations. The levels fall into 3 broad categories: a dumpy level, a Y level, and an automatic level. As with all tools of the surveyor, there are varying degrees of accuracy for each category of level. The dumpy level has a telescope with crosshairs permanently mounted in a pair of arms. The Y level has a telescope with crosshairs that is removable from the arms. And an automatic level is basically a dumpy level that has built-in compensator that it automatically adjusts for minor errors in the setup of the instrument. A level rod, used in conjunction with a level, is used to read an elevation up or down from the level of the telescope. From these observations, the surveyor can determine differences in elevation of different points from one location to another. Delaware County was founded on April 1st, 1808. It was carved out from Franklin County, and it was named for the Delaware Indians. Delaware County is bordered by Morrow to the north, Knox to the northeast, Licking to the east, Franklin County to the south, Union County to the west, and Marion to the northwest. And a map of Delaware County contains detailed information about roads and boundaries and may include rural areas, churches, cemeteries, etc. of the day. Delaware County's population as of the 1820 census was 759, and the 2020 federal census was 214,124. In 1820, Berlin Township was created. Once a number of residents met the criteria for creating a separate township by a survey, Berkshire Treasurer Asa Scott reviewed the residents' information and found that the village of Berlin met the population threshold to be a separate township within Delaware County. Berlin Township founding officials were Township Clerk Dr. Loofborough, Justice of the Peace, my father Joseph Easton, and Township Treasurer Asa Scott. And in 1822, I married Elizabeth B. Calkins Eaton on September 18, 1822. The following year, on July 19, 1823, our son George Calkins Eaton was born. He received his college at Madison University of New York and Denison University. In 1849, George helped me publish the 1849 Delaware County map. Later years, he was an insurance agent and moved to Zanesville for 9 years, where he was city engineer and streets commissioner. He returned to Delaware in 1861, where he served a 2-year term as superintendent of Delaware City Schools. In 1828, our second son was born on October 25, 1828, was Henry James Eaton. He graduated as one of 9 students in the class of 1849 from Ohio Wesleyan University. And as a practicing lawyer in Delaware, Henry also filed and processed land transactions, surveyed by myself and platted by his brother George. From 1822 to 1842, I served as Delaware County Surveyor, prominently connected to early county development. In 1834, myself and 4 other prominent citizens were appointed as judges at the very first Delaware County Fair, formerly known as the Delaware County Agricultural Society, in October of 1834. In 1836, a species circular was created through an executive order by President Andrew Jackson, which gave the information and the specific direction that only gold and silver would be accepted for purchase of federal lands. Survey worked slowed a bit during this time, as the average American couldn't afford to purchase land with gold or silver. And then in 1837, we had the Panic of 1837. It's a financial crisis in the United States that touched off a major depression which lasted until the mid-1840s. This also slowed westward expansion and allowed us to kind of catch up on all of the survey work that needed to be done here in Delaware County. 1842, I was elected to the Delaware County Auditor. I served until 1845, assisted by my son George as a deputy auditor for 3 years. In 1843, we moved to Delaware City from Berlin Township. Another event that happened during that year was the last Wyandot tribe left Ohio. On July 12, 1843, the Wyandots left their last settlement near Upper Sandusky in a procession of 120 wagons and buggies on their way to Kansas and ultimately to Oklahoma. One Wyandot remained and was a well-known figure in the Dublin area. His Wyandot name was Kihue, but he was also known as Bill Moose. In 1844, I was elected to 1 2-year term in the Ohio Senate, and so the completion of that term, I returned to Delaware until my passing in 1868. In 1849 was James and his sons, both George and Henry, had drafted the 1849 map of Delaware County. 1857 was the Panic of 1857. It was a financial panic in the United States caused by declining international economy and overexpansion of the domestic economy. This helped slow down some of the westward expansion of the country prior to the Civil War. People just not moving as much. And with the invention of the telegraph by Samuel F. Morse in 1844, the Panic of 1857 was the first financial crisis to spread rapidly throughout the United States. The world economy was more interconnected by the 1850s, which made that Panic of 1857 the first true worldwide economic crisis. In 1861 1865, we went through the Civil War. And even here in the Oak Grove Cemetery, we have the original soldier circle up near the front. And there are a new number of Civil War veterans buried here, including a Delaware resident, Jacob Schwigheimer, who was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions in the Battle of Vicksburg. And lastly, as time passes for all of us, in July 14th, 1868, Henry James Eaton passed away. Henry's buried here. And April 27th, 1887, his wife Elizabeth passed away. And December 10th, 1889, George C. passed away. And September 30th, 1903, Henry J. Eaton passed away. That was the family as they were here at that time. And it's just really amazing how much Delaware had grown in those early years, from the time that we became a state even until the late 1850s. And do you have any questions for anybody? I mean, there's mainly 4 graves here. You've got James and his wife Elizabeth, and there's Laura O'Kane, Hurley, who's one of the other daughters. Daughter Laura Eaton O'Kane, built here with her husband Tullius. And there are the exact grave sites for George C. and Henry James. I'm not absolutely sure where they're at, but they weren't listed in the official cemetery records.
Connect me with this James Eaton on this tombstone. Was who?
James Eaton was one of the early land surveyors in Delaware County.
Was he the father of the others?
He was the father of George C. and Henry James. They had 2 sons. And then he had a daughter, Laura Eaton, who was the wife of Tullius Keith O'Kane. And there was a young son who was just managed to live like 13 months that passed away in Cincinnati. And his name is mentioned on the other side of the tombstone. That person is Tullius E., son of T.C. and L.E. O'Kane, died in Cincinnati on December 28, 1858, aged 13 months and 8 days. But on the official cemetery map, they show 4, but there were other family members buried right around this section.
Well, hello. Thanks for stopping by. What a beautiful day. I'm glad to get out and get a breath of fresh air myself. My name's Clarence Hazelton, and you're probably wondering why there's 2 names on this tombstone, Robinson and Hazelton. Well, I'm buried here with my wife, Rose, and also her sister, Margaret, who married Hugh Robinson. And they're buried here as well. And unfortunately, their son, Herbert, is here, and he died in 1934 at age 15 of peritonitis. You know, in those days we didn't have antibiotics, so that was a fatal disease. I'm going to talk about some of my family and then talk about myself. My family, we were very involved in building Delaware in the early 1900s. So I'm going to start by talking about my parents. And I was born in 1873, and that was about the time Wayne Hazelton and Harriet Hazelton moved to Delaware from Oxford Township. Wayne got started lumbering and teaming and making railroad ties for the new Columbus and Toledo Railroad that was being built on the west side of Delaware. That where across Delaware Run, they were building a wooden trestle, and that was right beside George and Elizabeth Campbell's blue limestone quarry. In 1880, Wayne bought a tract of land at the corner of Park Avenue and Toledo Street, and he built a saloon and boarding house. And shown in this picture, taken in 1890, is that house. And Wayne and Harriet are in the photo, along with my grandfather, William Hazelton, and 3 of my younger sisters. And last I knew, that house was still standing. So Wayne was a successful contractor. He built a lot of highways and streets in Delaware County. He was also an early adopter of automobiles. He was a founding member of the Delaware Auto Club in 1910 and owned a Ford Model T, and made a lot of trips in that car. He also operated a quarry on the west side of the railroad, across from Blue Limestone Quarry. He had his own quarry, making aggregate that he used in his road business. Then there was my brother William. William got into the concrete block business. He made the textured concrete blocks that you see on foundations around Delaware, and they also made complete houses. They built a demonstrator house across the street from the house on Park and Toledo on Toledo Street that showed how blocks could be used to make an entire house. They also made curved blocks that were used in cisterns and silos around Delaware County, and they would do that, building those as well. He actually patented a machine to make these concrete blocks, and he partnered with a guy named Robert Greer, who had moved down from Shelby and opened up the Delaware Foundry and Machine Company on Toledo Street. And they'd build a machine. They took it up to Chicago to the 1917 concrete show to demonstrate it. And then they tried to develop to sell those. Another brother was John Bird. John and Bird, my brother-in-law, Bird Frost. They had a construction company, and they also built houses in the streets. They built another demonstrator house for using Williams blocks up on Pennsylvania Avenue. You can see these blocks were built using a number of buildings around Delaware. The old Dello Screw Plant, which was on the corner of South Franklin and Spring Street, and the Delaware Cab Company on North Union were made of these blocks. John also did a lot of concrete work, and I've got an example here. I forgot to show you a picture of William Hazelton's cement block factory that was located on Toledo Street. John, here's an example of their work. This was a horse watering trough that they made, and it shows their builder's stamp on it that says Hazelton and Frost. That was the name of their company. And this horse trough is still on South Sandusky Street as well. Well, I also was in contracting, and I had met my wife Rose, and we were married in 1898, and our only child, Ruth, was born in 1904. We lived at a number of houses in the south end of Delaware before 1910, when I built us a house on Park Avenue at 105 Park Avenue. It was a beautiful house. We built it with bricks that came from my brother George's brick kiln, which is also located on Park Avenue on the other side of the railroad tracks. He had about 7 acres there that he farmed and also made bricks. And later on, that land eventually became the land that they built the Sunray Stove Plant in the late 1950s. I also, in doing my work, I had a mold for making concrete balls, and you'll see I use those on my house, but I understand they're not there anymore. But they were used around the county, and you'll see them on a number of houses and on fence posts, on the corner posts for farms. You'll see concrete balls. That was my work. My house was really beautiful. It was across the street from the Delaware City Park. But in 1937, Delaware decided to build a water tower in the middle of that park, and it really ruined our view. So we sued Delaware over that. And they actually wound up paying us damages for destroying our view. Some of the contracting work I did in 1906, I had a contract to build Wootring Street between South Sandusky and Henry Street. And this was prior to the CDM Interurban Company building the car barn there. So we called it macadamizing. that was a scientific method developed by a Scottish engineer of building streets using paving, or basically grading the dirt first, get that to the shape that you want, and then starting building up successive layers of aggregate or gravel, starting with larger sizes and ending up with a fine gravel on the surface that, once it was wet, became fairly waterproof. And with the crown on the street, the water would drain into the gutters that we built. Another project I had was they replaced the bridge over the Delaware Run on South Sandusky Street, and I had the contract to redo the substructure. When we got in there, we found there was actually quicksand, very unstable, and the stone foundation was resting on wooden boards that were not holding up. So the first thing I had to do was, with a lot of concrete, was build up a stable substructure. Lewis Dennison, and I understand you were just talking to Charlotte Dennison. Lewis Dennison was her grandfather's brother. He started the Delaware Iron and Bridge Company. He had the contract to rebuild the superstructure in that bridge. Well, then in 1909, I was appointed superintendent of streets for the city of Delaware. One of our main jobs was periodically, in the business district we did it twice a week, and in the residential once a week, was flushing the streets. And remember, we had a lot of horses back in those days, so we were responsible for cleaning the streets. In 1912, we had a large cyclone come through central Ohio and did a lot of damage in Delaware, damaged buildings, and also knocked down some very beautiful mature trees. So we had a lot of cleanup to do back then, in 1912. And then, of course, 9 months later, in March of 1913, we had a huge flood. And that night, it was a long night, we were out helping people move out of harm's way and trying to convince others not to ride out the flood, to get out of their houses. And many of them listened, but not all, and some didn't survive that flood. And then I spent a month cleaning up, and I had 18 to 22 men working for me, and usually 9 to 10 teams of horses and wagons hauling all the debris out. While just between Delaware Run and Fountain Avenue on Union Street, we took out 600 wagon loads of muck. We saved as much gravel and stone that could be reused. I was very careful with the city's money, and wherever possible, we would try to save money. I got a lot of kudos from Delaware for doing that. Another interesting adventure, in 1913, Delaware bought their first fire truck. And I rode the jerk with a bunch of Delaware people. The jerk was the nickname for the local train on the Big 4 Railroad that went out to Springfield. So we rode out and then brought this fire truck back, and we started to use it on the east side of Delaware, and unfortunately that put some horses out of work. So they auctioned the horses, and my brother John bought one of these horses, actually named Old John, and retired him to his wife's riding stable, which was located on Park Avenue, close to where the high school football stadium was eventually built. I was interested in technology and development, and in 1926, Russell Kistner was developing an area up around Griswold Street and Lincoln Avenue, and I had a contract to extend Dent Street over to Forest Avenue. And I did that, and I brought in a gas-powered shovel that was so fast we kept 3 dump trucks going constantly trying to haul the dirt away as we graded that street. That was eventually renamed Elmwood Street. Well, in 1948, my wife Rose died, and at that point I moved to the upstairs of my house and began renting out the first floor of my house. In the late 1950s, a young couple, John and Kathleen Schmidt, moved in to the first floor of my house. And they had 3 children, and pretty quickly added number 4. I remember the oldest boy, his name was Steve, and he loved to play with trucks, and me being a contractor, we had a lot in common. And they put a sandbox beside my house, and there's Steve with his trucks and doing a construction project in the sand. So I owned the house beside us, and I had rented out one side of it to Kathleen's mother, Helga Morrison, and they set up a badminton net between the 2 houses in the driveway, and we had a lot of fun summer evenings out there playing badminton. Schmidt, they bought a house on Montrose Avenue in 1960, and I was explaining to them how my family and I had built all of those streets, Montrose Avenue, Campbell, Columbus Avenue, and Toledo Street. That was all our work, sidewalks and curbing. So, well, I almost made it to 100. I died in 1973. My daughter Ruth, who has lived most of her life in Shelby, Ohio, died the year before I did. And many of my family were interred at the Old Delaware Mausoleum. But Rose and I chose this spot, and I think it's a very nice place to rest in peace. So I want to thank you for stopping by. It was nice talking to you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Good afternoon. My name is Delphina Mendenhall. My husband is George C. Mendenhall, a wealthy plantation owner in Guilford County, North Carolina. George was a Quaker, as am I. And we both believed that slavery was wrong. God never intended for one man to own another man. Therefore, we vowed that we would free all of our slaves. You see, in 1824, George's wife, his first wife, Eliza Dunn, passed away 2 years into their marriage after childbirth. George, as a result, inherited 25 of her slaves. The Quaker Church disowned him for that reason, but nevertheless, he stuck to his convictions to free slaves, and he worked in the Manumission Society. This was a society that worked to free slaves legally. Later, George purchased a horse and he expanded his law practice, and that he and I met. 10 years later, we were married. George's slaves thrived. They now numbered over 100. George wanted his slaves to be able to sustain themselves and their families in their new lives. Therefore, he educated his slaves. He taught them to read and to write and to cipher, and he also taught them skills such as harness making, shoemaking, carpentry, catering, and many, many other skills. George even taught his slaves to operate the cotton gin. Well, in 1830, North Carolina started to realize that we Quakers were buying slaves to protect and free them. Therefore, they created a law that would not allow a person to free their own slaves. Therefore, they created a law to prohibit anyone from freeing their own slaves, unless it was through meritorious conduct to the state. So we Quakers had to look for other options. We started to send slaves on ships like the Sally Ann to Haiti and to Liberia. However, due to political reasons, financial reasons, and the attitudes of the slaves who settled there, this turned out to be unsatisfactory. Next, we looked to the Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And George, between 1825 and 1850, sent 50 slaves to Ohio. This was with the cooperation and the assistance of a Quaker by the name of Aaron S. Benedict and the Alum Creek Friends Church. They settled in Brown, Oxford, and Prue Township in Morrow in Delaware County. In the 1840s, we had as many as 45 free, uneducated Negro children in our Alum Creek Friends School. At those times that George could not send the slaves by himself, he would send a free Negro who had been his field foreman by the name of Willis White. Mr. White had power of attorney to purchase freedom certificates for the slaves, and then he would return the wagons and the horses back to George. George requested that all of the slaves use the last name of Mendenhall. However, many of those slaves changed their names back to former slave names of Gardner, Cook, Lewis, and Lindsay. In 1855, George sent John White with 28 slaves to Logan County, Ohio. He was assisted by 2 Quakers, Asa Williams and Joshua Mormon. George was very, very concerned about his oldest and his youngest charges. And in 1852, anticipating the trip to Logan, Ohio, George wrote to his uncle Isaac in Indiana to please look after a little boy by the name of Columbus Mendenhall. The 6-year-old boy had fallen into a fire and was badly burned and scarred on his face and his body, and he wanted someone to look after the welfare of the child. Unfortunately, in 1857, George sent up more slaves to Ohio, but I regret that I have lost those records. Sadly, I lost my beloved George in a tragic buggy accident on the Uwharrie River. 2 months later, North Carolina seceded from the Union, and in April of 1861, war was declared, and there I was, left with 28 more slaves to free during war times. I made many attempts, but I was thwarted many times by contentious neighbors and Southern sympathizers. One time I managed to get passports to Baltimore, which would take my slaves on to Ohio. In 1863, I took my slaves with me to Richmond, to the line, and I was told that if I crossed that line, I would never be allowed to go back to North Carolina. Therefore, I had to entrust my family to a Northern Union soldier. I heard a year later that they had all arrived safely. This left me with 13 young men of conscription age. I didn't want them to have to fight in the war, so I sent them to work on the railroad. In 1865, they were emancipated. Some of those young men stayed in Guilford County, while others went back up to Alum Creek in Ohio to live with family and friends. And thus, I had completed the terms of George's will, and I had freed over 100 slaves.
Here in Delaware County, Camp Delaware was a Union military camp divided by 2 different cultural groups, separated by the Olentangy River. On the west side of the river, white troops were organized as the 96th and the 121st Regiment. On the east side of the river, colored troops were organized as the 127th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, the 5th United States Colored Infantry, and the 27th United States Infantry. I will end my story telling you about an 18-year-old Whitman Mendenhall from Logan, Ohio. In December 1863, Whitman Mendenhall was enlisted as a private with the 27th United States Colored Infantry and was assigned to Company A at Camp Delaware. 1 month later, he died. Not on the battlefield, but at Camp Delaware. A terrible disease took his life. Private Whitman Mendenhall was buried along with many other unknown Negro soldiers located in the center of the Soldiers Circle here in Oak Grove Cemetery. Thank you for listening.
Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. I'm a ghost and I should have been in the Oak Grove Cemetery, but I don't like rain. So I'm coming to you from the Nash House. I'm so glad to see you. So I'm here to talk about Helen, Mabel, and Hazel Wells, the only children of William and Stella Wells. They died of scarlet fever in 1914. They're buried in Potter's Field in Oak Grove Cemetery. Potter's Field is now called Wander's Home, and it's not clear when the name was changed. There are very few tombstones in Potter's Field, so you're not missing much by being here. That's because the people who are buried there are paupers, the poor, or the unidentified. The Wells family were among the poor, and I'll talk about them a little later. But the name Potter's Field, where did that come from? Well, it comes from biblical times. The story is complicated, but it had to do with the death of Judas Iscariot. He had been paid for identifying Jesus but the high priest considered that to be blood money, and they didn't want to use it for anything. They finally decided to use the coins to bury strangers, criminals, and the poor. Why was it called Potter's Field? Well, that's because the land that the priests bought is where potters had collected high-quality clay to use to produce ceramics. And the name stuck, and it's used for burying poor people around the country, this country. So you're probably wondering who I am and how I'm related to the Wells family. Well, I was not a family member, but I knew them very well. I prefer to remain anonymous, like the hundreds of souls who are buried in Wonder's home. Back in 1914, there was an outbreak of scarlet fever, also known as scarlatina, here in Delaware County, and actually throughout the state. Dr. Floyd Miller, the health officer, tried to dispel rumors that the outbreak was a serious epidemic. On December 18, 1914, the same month the little Wells girls died, he was quoted in the Delaware Daily Journal Herald as saying, "There are at present 41 cases in the city. 14 of them are among students at Ohio Wesleyan University, all of whom are quarantined in the old gymnasium at the rear of the campus. There's 6 cases in one family, 3 families in which there are 3 cases. This leaves 7 cases in other families and makes but 13 cases in the city under quarantine. But 2 of those families have been quarantined in the last 6 days. So within the next week, 13 of the cases will be released from quarantine. There have been no cases developed within the schoolrooms, and I believe the epidemic is now thoroughly under control. And while there may be a few more cases coming down through the winter, there's little possibility that there will be a continued epidemic. There's absolutely no danger for 2 persons coming to Delaware to do their shopping." Did you notice? He didn't mention any deaths. Well, the news article goes on to say, "From the above statement, we will be seeing that rumors which have been circulated over the county are greatly exaggerated. Scarlet fever seems to exist largely all over the state this winter. Not only is Delaware City combating cases, but there is much scarlet fever over the county." Nevertheless, I know that many people were taken ill, and quarantine signs like these were placed on homes. At least 31 people died. And you wonder how I know their names? Well, they were printed in the newspaper. Children like Hazel Mabel and Helen Wells, and 2-year-old Irene Catherine Peters, who was a relative of the Wells family, and they lived nearby on Fair Avenue. Most of the deceased were children, including John Bernard, age 2, Woodrow Edwin Butts, age 13 months, Lillian Marnell, age 10, and a 20-year-old Ohio Wesleyan student died of scarlet fever in December after returning to his hometown. What causes scarlet fever, you wonder? And are you at risk? Well, in 1914, we don't really know the cause. We think it may be spread by flies, and we are cautioned not to buy foodstuffs where flies are tolerated, or to eat where flies have access to food. We think that flies are the most dangerous insects known to man, and they are the carriers of millions of death-dealing disease germs. In schools, children make fly traps in the spring to catch the first flies out of their winter quarters to help prevent diseases. Milk is also suspected to contribute to the spread of scarlet fever because of the unsanitary conditions where it's produced. We are also cautioned that touching the ill may spread the disease, so we keep our fingers to ourselves. What are the symptoms of scarlet fever? Doctors warn the public to consult them immediately if a child has a sore throat, because that is one of the first signs of scarlet fever. As it progresses, patients develop swollen glands, nausea, vomiting, a headache, a fever, and a rash. There is a white coating on the tongue. It peels away after a few days, leaving the tongue red and swollen, and that is known as strawberry tongue. The face is flushed, and the rash is red and blanching. Typically feels like sandpaper, and the tongue may be red and bumpy. There's no treatment for scarlet fever back in 1914, In fact, in the early 20th century, scarlet fever was the leading cause of death of children. I've heard that doctors today know that scarlet fever is caused by streptococcus bacteria that is spread by droplets in the air. And there is a cure, something called antibiotics. All that came too late for the poor little Wells girls and so many others. So, I told you that we are here to remember the Wells children. 7-month-old Hazel died on December 9th, followed by 5-year-old Helen Marie on December 12th. 3-year-old Mabel died on December 27th. As I said, in 1914, they were the only children of William and Stella Wells. But they had another daughter, Donna Bell, in January, just 2 weeks after their youngest child had died. Now, I'm certainly not one to gossip myself, but I've heard rumors that someone, maybe Stella Wells, wasn't right in the head for quite a few years. Those 3 girls were alive in the 1920 United States Census, and their ages are given at the ages they would have been had they not died in 1914. Now, I find that rather strange. What about you? William and Stella went on to have 11 more children after losing their first 3 little girls. They had 6 boys and 5 more girls. Like William and Stella, most of the children didn't go beyond the 8th grade. They moved to rural Delaware County and lived in several different townships. William was a farmer, but he never owned any land. And the 1940 census says that the family is on relief most of the time. That's really sad. William died in 1960, and he's buried in Oak Grove Cemetery. And Stella died in 1968, and she's buried in Kilbourne. Thank you for coming to visit me, and I hope you come back soon.
People said I was eccentric. People said I was crazy. People said I was nuts. People, wait a minute. Oh, hello. I'm Mary Honore Grady. I was born September 9th, 1872, to John and Bridget Grady. I had 2 brothers, Owen and Frank. Well, we lived about 7 miles from here on 600 acres. We were farmers, and we were good farmers, and we made a lot of money being farmers. We also had some interest in some investments in cement. So we were very fortunate. Well, people thought we were odd. Well, we were frugal. My dad was very frugal, and he made sure that when we spent money, we only spent what we had to. Now, the doctor we were seeing would charge for office visits and home visits. My father got it down to where we only had to pay $1 to go to the office, and we only had to pay $3 if he came to us. Well, one time he came to us, and he made some observations, which he was not afraid to tell other people about. He said they had no electricity, that we had no running water, and we had no toilet facilities. Well, okay, that's the way we lived, but he decided he had to go tell everybody about it. There was one other time he came to visit, and he noticed that I was huddled in front of the fireplace with an overcoat. And that was where we got our heat, that I was huddled there. And then he said, I observed that she was about 5 feet 6 inches tall, that was me, that I had a constant frown on my face, that I was undernourished, and that I was eccentric. In other words, he thought I was a bit odd. But he did say I was extremely intelligent. So there was that. Well, there was this Journal Herald that came out in Delaware. It was sort of like a directory. It gave names of people, where they lived, what their occupation was, even what their telephone number was. I was listed in that 1905 journal as a milliner. Now, I had a millinery shop at 5 West Winter Street in Delaware. Well, being a milliner takes a lot. It's a lot more than just sticking feathers in a hat and putting ribbons on things. Mercury nitrate was used to convert pelts into fur hats, into the hats, and to process it so that the pelts could be made into hats. It was used for stuffing, you know, little animals and all of that. Well, here's the thing about mercury nitrate. It can mess with your head. It can change and alter your thinking. It can give you speech tremors. It can make you hallucinate. All in all, it makes you a little on the crazy side. Thus the term Mad Hatter. And that term came out way before Alice in Wonderland. Luckily in the 1940s, the United States banned the use of mercury nitrate. But for some people, they probably look at me and think, well, the damage was already done. Oh well. 1912, I bought a house in Delaware on the northwest corner of Liberty Street and Griswold Street. 157 North Liberty. But you can't find 157 North Liberty anymore, but you can still see the house. The house is still standing. It's a beautiful brick house. Somewhere down the line, somebody changed where they got their mail from Liberty Street to Griswold Street. And now it is 90 Griswold Street. So the house is still there. At one point, the fire department had to come because the furnace was malfunctioning and it all filled up with smoke. But luckily, nothing happened. But I had extra rooms, and I would sublet some of them to other people as a way to make a little bit more money. 1936, my father passed away. He left all 600 acres to me. The grounds had multiple buildings. Every one of the white barns was painted white, and it said Shamrock Acres. Shamrock because my mother was from Ireland. Shamrock Acres, Mary Grady proprietor. Every single one of those white state barns had that. There were multiple buildings there. I was living in one of the houses, the 100-year-old house. The heater decided to malfunction. It was an oil heater. I was boiling some water on the stove. Flames. And the flames were just taking over. It was also a windy day. Well, there were some neighbors and people who lived close by, and there were some passers-by, and they all came and they were trying to get whatever they could out of the house. It was really, really hard to watch all this happen. But the house just burnt to the ground. So where was the fire department? Well, we were right in between Waldo and Delaware. We don't know if Waldo even got the message that there was a fire. They never showed up. Thing is about the Delaware one, the only fire truck that was allowed to go into the county was being repaired that week and being overhauled and being repainted. There was one other truck that could have come, but Fire Chief Fred Bills said it couldn't leave the corporate area of Delaware. So our house burned to the ground, and that's what it was. But luckily those winds that were blowing and fanned the flames of the house fire avoided the stables and the other buildings. I eventually moved into the other house. Well, a friend of mine said, she quoted this to other people. She said, Mary Grady lives like the poorest person in the world. She has sparse furnishings and lives like a pauper. Well, I didn't have very many furnishings because most of them had died from the other house. So I didn't need much either. So people thought I was crazy and eccentric. Well, here's one of the things I did. I had one light bulb in my house. I had put electricity in my house. So what I did was go from room to room. If I wanted to go from room to room, I'd take my light bulb, I'd take it out of one socket, one lamp, I'd go to another room, I'd put it into another lamp, another socket, turn that light on. I didn't see any reason to waste electricity. and I only needed one light bulb. The other thing I would do, I'd go to the banks. I didn't get a newspaper where I lived. So I would go to the bank and I would clip the coupons from the flyers and the newspapers that were there. Now, everybody clips coupons to some degree, right? But the thing is, what people thought that was strange was I would keep them for like 20 years and never use them. But you know what? I had them in case I needed it. People would send me checks. I didn't cash them. I just collected some cash, didn't worry about it. So in 1953, enough people had observed me and said I was incompetent. Incompetent. Well, guess where they put me? They put me in Mount Carmel Hospital. They gave me a private room. They gave me round-the-clock nursing. It cost me $25,000 a year to have this private room and round-the-clock care. I was there for 12 years at the cost of $300,000. That's where I spent my last days. So about now you might be wondering, okay, so all of this, how did this lead to having a hospital named after me? Well, I got to thinking. I knew my land was worth about $4 million. So I decided I need to make a will. So I did. In the early 1950s, I made one will. I listed 3 religious groups. 2 Catholic and 1 Methodist. Said, okay, this is the order. If you want my money, this is the way it's going to go. The thing is, the money had to be used to build a 50-bed hospital on my property and name it after me. That was the way the will was set up. But, and this is what they didn't want to do, they had to, I also put it in there, they had to farm the land for 40 years, and the profits of that land then would be used to maintain the hospital. Not anybody wanted to do that. All right, well, the problem was, the first problem was, only will they could find for that will was a carbon copy. And they said, this won't work, it has to be the original. So I rewrote another one. When I wrote the other one, I didn't put the people in the same order as I did the first time. So that will just kind of sat there. And then along comes March 17th, 1951. I wrote another will. And I wrote it in green ink. Can you tell? That was St. Patrick's Day. Wrote it in green ink. I had befriended a man named Mr. Frank Kelly. Now, Mr. Frank Kelly and I got along very well. Mr. Frank Kelly came from the Sinclair Oil Company, and he was not the first person that came to me from the Sinclair Oil Company. They'd been sending people for years. They wanted to run an oil pipeline through my land. Well, I just kept shooing them off, but along comes Mr. Kelly, an Irish Catholic. And I said, you know what? I think maybe we could do business together. So I rewrote my will. Half of my fortune would go to Mr. Kelly. The other half would be divided up between St. Mary's Church, Mount Carmel, and a cousin of mine. Oh my goodness. The uproar that came from that will was not only around here, not only in Ohio, not only within our country, but other countries as well. All said, no way, this is not right, this is not what you really wanted. And they thought that this Mr. Kelly guy had kind of taken advantage of me. Well, here's the deal. Mr. Ed Flay Hive Sr., a name that was very prominent in Delaware, was the person who was looking out for my will. He said, this is not what she wants. And then there's a case of J&M Case Hospital. It was already in Delaware. It was needing to expand. It needed more bed space. It needed more rooms. It needed to be upgraded in technology. It was really kind of on the old side. Mr. Clyde Lewis, who was also an attorney in Delaware, well known, and he also was representing, he was a trustee to J&M Case Hospital, and he was representing the hospital. Those two got together. They used something called cyprès, which is French for as close as possible. So they got together and said, you know what? Her money would be best used to upgrade Jane M. Case Hospital and rename it Grady Memorial Hospital. They took all of this to a Mr. Judge Weller, and he looked at it and he said, I agree. This is the best use of her money to best fit what she really wanted. And my cousins and the people that knew me were pleased. So, 1976, Jane M. Case is remodeled, redone, up to speed, and it is then Grady Memorial Hospital. I got my hospital in Delaware. But here's the crazy thing that was happening. On the day, this is the house I lived in, on the day of my funeral at St. Mary's Church at 10:30 in the morning, just as my funeral was happening, my house was being torn down. The reason it was being torn down is because the state of Ohio wanted to use my land, about 33 acres of it, to expand 23 North. And by the way, Mr. Kelly did get some money, St. Mary's Church got some money, and Mount Carmel got some money. So I made a whole lot of people. Thank you for coming.